Howdy, and welcome to LeeReads, where I talk about the books I've been reading and enjoying lately. Today, I want to talk about two standalone fantasy novels that I highly recommend. One is adult, and one is young adult with a touch of romance. If you're a fan of fantasy, likely you will enjoy at least one of these two recommendations. It's nice sometimes to settle down with a standalone novel when there's a lot going on, like in the summertime, and it can be hard to commit to a series. Plus, if you're anything like me, you're already in the middle of way too many series as it is. Sometimes a standalone is highly appreciated. Without further ado, a Raven-themed edition of standalone fantasy novels. The first novel is The Raven Tower by Ann Leckie. Relatively recent, but not a brand new release. And I feel like this novel is underrated. I haven't heard about a lot of people talking about it. And that may be because it's presented in a little bit of a challenging format. This novel is one with a slower pace that you really need to kind of digest as you go. And that may be because one of the main perspectives of the story is a god that has lived for a really long time and is somewhat narrating the story to the main character, Iolo. And what I mean by that is that these passages are told in the second person. The story opens with the first line beginning, "I first saw you when you rode out of the forest." That's the perspective you're grounded in, while as a reader you're kind of figuring out what's going on here. And what's happening in the story is that you, Iolo, are the aide to a noble's son. In this culture, they worship a god called the Raven, and the person empowered to speak and do auguries on behalf of the Raven is called the Raven's Lease. You are aide to the son of the Raven's Lease. Mowing occurring. I apologize. You are the aide and companion to the son of the Raven's Lease. The Raven's Lease has gone missing, and his son has come to take his place. So you have returned from this war that you've been fighting with this person that's become your good friend to help them as they take their new position in the city. The only problem is things aren't as they seem. The circumstances under which the Raven's Lease has disappeared are very suspicious, and you are bound and determined to figure out what truly happened. As this little investigation is unfolding, there are, of course, interested parties in the town who are powerful, who may or may not want your friend to come to power. We also get flashbacks from the perspective of the storyteller, and we learn that the storyteller is a god. In this world, there are a variety of different gods. They gain power when people pray to them. So more powerful gods like the Raven god are ones that have a larger following than other smaller gods, but they still can exert their will and influence on the world. So the story is told, I think, in a very interesting combination of flashbacks as this god that's telling you the story is kind of ramping up to make a point. Meanwhile, you as the main character are figuring out what's going on with your friend's missing father and how that interconnects with what the various gods want. I thought that the tension in this novel was so well done. If you're paying attention to what you're being told in the flashback, you are starting to get inklings about bad things that may be happening in the present with your main character. But you do have to be patient when reading this novel because at first the flashbacks may not seem that pertinent and you just want to get back to the main story. I did feel that way at first, I admit. So this is a story that you need to go into with patience, or at least not expecting an extremely fast-paced story, because if that's what you want when you sit down to read this novel, you're not going to like it. I found that the audiobook format was the more satisfying way to experience this novel, since it's told in a second person and a narrator is telling kind of the main character what happened in the past, but also in a sense narrating what they're currently doing. Listening to that being told to me made the story feel more powerful. So if you can get your hands on the audiobook, I highly recommend it. To summarize, The Raven Tower by Ann Leckie, adult fantasy, standalone, presented to you in second person. I highly recommend it. Please give this one a chance. It's one that I enjoyed so much I want to get it for my bookshelf. The next novel is a young adult fantasy with a romantic subplot, An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. This novel does center fairies, but it has such a novel premise. In this world, fairies cannot craft, they can't make things. That includes art, but also things you wouldn't think of, like cooking and tailoring. Anything that involves creating something with your own hands, their magic prevents them from doing that. So they like to hire humans to do those things for them. The main character in this story is a very accomplished portrait artist named Isabel, who has done dealings with the Fae before, and they sort of recommend her name to others. Every now and then, a new Fae client will come to her to have their portrait done, but of course she also does regular folks as well. One day, a Raven Lord named Rook comes to have his portrait done. He is somewhat of an infamous Fae prince that has a dark history, and Isabel has more apprehension of him than she usually does around fairies, because when you're around fairies, you have to be very careful with your words. They give payment and spells, but they're very quick to take advantage of that. Of course, throughout the weeks-long process of Rook visiting Isabel as she's working on his portrait, they begin to develop somewhat of a relationship that is forbidden, and Isabel is in denial that she actually feels these strong feelings for Rook. She finishes the portrait for him, gives it to him, and thinks, I'm never gonna see this person again. Then Rook shows up to drag her away in the middle of the night because something has gone wrong with him regarding her portrait, and she has to go into the fairy realm to stand trial. And that's basically where our story goes from there. The world building itself and how the Fae clash with humans is very interesting. In a sense, it's more of a quiet story. Unlike other popular young adult fantasy series out there and within the last 5 years that deal with fairies, this isn't one that's an epic in scale where it's like Fae versus humankind. This is more of a quiet story dealing with the lives of this particular smaller group of people and how Isabel's art can impact that. I just loved the idea of, one, the main character being an artist, and two, the main character being one that is extremely reluctant and does not want to become a fairy because then she wouldn't be able to do her art anymore. So in addition to the unique world building, I really liked the main character Isabel, and also there's just a layer of kind of humor, like there's a layer of subtle humor overlaying the narrative in the description. At the beginning, Isabel's two adopted sisters were actually billy goats that were turned into humans by a spell, and so they're just running around being destructive like billy goats, except for their little girls. It's just very funny. So it's just a warning of how fairy magic can go wrong. And it's just a very satisfying read and an interesting twist to a fairy story if you're into that. Get your hands on this one to read, especially at the beginning of autumn. If you're a mood reader, I think that will feel the most satisfying because of how the forest within the story is described. That's it. Those are two Raven-themed standalone fantasy novels. One is adult, one is young adult with a dash of romance. They're quite different in tone and pacing, and yet they both deliver a very standalone, completed story. Highly recommended. Please let me know your thoughts if you've read either one of these, or if you think that you might after reading this review, come back and tell me what you thought about it in the comments. If you have other standalone fantasy recommendations for me, please suggest them. I'm looking for more, and I want to be able to recommend more to you on this channel in the future. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. I'm trying to grow my channel. And don't forget to support your local library. Thanks. Bye.